Namaskar. Thus speak, thus spoke Zarathustra, Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche. Introduction by Miss Forster, Nietzsche. How Zarathustra came into being. Zarathustra is my brother's most personal work. It is the history of his most individual experiences, of of his friendshipness, ideals, raptures, bitter bitterest disappointments and sorrows. Above it all, however, their source tran- transfiguring in it the image of his greatest hopes and remotest aims. My brother had the figure of Zarathustra in his mind from his very earliest youth. He once told me that even as a child he had dreamed of him. At different periods of his life, he would call this hunter of his dream by different names. But in the end, he declares in a note on the subject, I had to I had to do a Persian the honor of identifying him with with this creature of my fancy. Pers- Persians were the first to take a broad and comprehensive view of history. Every series of evolutions, according to them, was presided over by a prophet, and every prophet had his Hazar, his dynasty of 1,000 years. All Zarathustra's view, as also his personality, were early conception of my brother's mind. Whoever reads his posthumously published writings for the years 1869 to 82 with care will constantly meet with passages suggestive of Zarathustra's thought and doctrine. For instance, the ideal of the Superman is put forth quite clearly in all his writings during the years 1873 to 75, and in We philologists, the following remarkable observations occurs: how can one praise and glorify a nation as a whole? Even among the Greeks, it was the individuals that counted. The Greeks are interestingly The Greeks are interesting and extremely important because they reared such a vast number of great individuals. How was this possible? The question is one which ought to be studied. I am interested only in the relations of a people to the rearing of the individual man, and among the Greeks, the conditions the conditions were unusually favorable for the development of the individual, not by any means owing to the goodness of the people, but because of the struggle of the evil ins- instincts. With the help of favorable measures, great individuals might be reared who would be both different from and higher than those who heretofore have owed their existence to mere chance. Here we may still be hopeful in the rearing of exceptional men. The notion of rearing the Superman is only a new form of an ideal Nietzsche already had in his mouth, that the object of mankind should lie in its highest individuals, or as he writes in Isco Schopenhauer as educator, mankind ought constantly to be striving to produce great men. This and nothing else is its duty. But the ideals he most reveres in those days are no longer held to be the highest type of man. No, around this future ideal of a coming humanity, the Superman, the poet spread the veil of becoming, who can tell to what glorious heights man can still ascend. That is why, after having tasted the worth of our noblest ideal, that of the Savior, in the light of the new valuations. The poet cries with passionate emphasis in Zarathustra, never yet, never yet hath there been a Superman. Naked have I seen both of them, the greatest and the smallest man. All too similar are they still to each other. Very, verily, even the greatest found I all too human. The phrase "the rearing of the Superman" has very often been misunderstood by the word rearing. In his case, is meant the act of modifying by means of new and higher values, values which, as laws and guides of conduct and opinion, are now to rule over mankind. In general, the doctrine of the Superman can only be understood correctly in conjunction with other ideas of the authors, such as the order of rank, the will to power, and the transvaluation of all values. He assumes that Christianity, as a product of the resentment uh, bots and the weak, has put in ban all that is beautiful, strong, proud, and powerful. In fact, all the qualities resulting from strength, and that in consequence all forces which tend to promote or elevate life has been seriously undermined. Now, however, a new table of valuations must be placed over mankind, namely that of the strong, mighty, and magnificent man, overflowing with life and elevated to his zenith, the Supreme, who is now put before us with overpowering passion as the aim of our life, hope, and will. And just as the old system of valuing, which only extolled the qualities favorable to the weak, the suffering, and the oppressed, have succeeded in producing a weak, suffering, and modern race. So, this new and reversed system of valuing ought to rear a healthy, strong, lively, and courageous type, which would be a glory to life itself. Stated briefly, the leading principle of this new system of valuing would be all that proceeds from power is good, all that springs from weakness is bad. This type must not be regarded as fanciful figure. It is not a nebulous hope which is to be realized at some indefinitely remote period, thousands of years hence, nor is it a new species in the Darwinian sense of which we can know nothing, and which it would therefore be somewhat absurd to strive after. But it is meant to be a possibility which men of the present could realize with all their spiritual and physical energies, provided they adopted the new values. The author of Zarathustra never lost sight of that egregious example of a transvaluation of all values through Christianity, whereby the defied mode of life and thought of the Greeks, as well as a strong Romedom, was almost annihilated or transvalued in a comparatively short time, could could not have rejuvenated Greco-Roman system of valuing once it had been refined and made more profound by the schooling which 2000 years of Christianity had provided. Effect another such revolution within a calculable period of time until the glorious type of manhood shall finally appear, which is to be our new faith and hope, and in the creation of which Zarathustra exhorts us to participate. In his private notes on the subject, the author uses the expression Superman, always in the singular, by and signifying the most thoroughly well constituted, type as opposed to modern man. Above all, however, he designates Zarathustra himself as an example of the Superman. In Eco Homo is a careful to enlighten us concerning the pre- pre- precursors and prerequisites to the advent of this higher type in referring to a certain passage in the gay science. In order to understand this type, we must first be quite clear in regard to the leading physiological condition on which it depends. This condition is what I call great healthiness. I know not how to express my meaning more bluntly or more personality than I have done already is one of the last chapter aphorism of the fifth book of the Gaya Sainza. I have done already in one of the last chapters, aphorism 382 of the fifth book of the Gaya Sainza. We, the new nameless, the hard to understand. The it says there we firstlings of a yet untried future we require for a new end, also a new means, namely a new healthiness, strong, sharper, tougher, bolder, and merrier than all healthiness he through. He whose soul longeth to experience the whole range of Heathrow recognized values and desirabilities, and to circumnavigate all the coasts of the ideal Mediterranean Sea, who from the adventures of his most personal experience wants to know how it feels to be a conqueror and discoverer of the ideal, as likewise how it is with the artist, the saint, the legislature, the sage, the scholar, the devotee, the prophet, and the godly non conformist of the old style requires one thing above all for that purpose: great such healthiness as one not only possesses but also consequently acquires and must acquire, because one unceasingly sacrifices it again and must sacrifice it. And now, after having been long on the way in this fashion, we are Argonauts of the ideal, more courageous perhaps than prudent, and often enough shipwrecked and brought to grief, nevertheless dangerously healthy, always healthy again. It would seem as if it recompense for it all, that we have a still undiscovered country before us, the boundaries of which no one has yet seen, a beyond of all countries and corners of the ideal known. He through a world so overrich in the beautiful, the strange, the questionable, the frightful, and the divine, that our curiosity as well as our thirst for purge possession thereof have got out of hand. Alas, that nothing will now any longer satisfy us. How could we still be content with the man of the present day after such outlooks and with such a craving in our conscience and consciousness? Sad enough, but it is unavoidable that we should look on the worthiest aim and hopes of the men of the present day with ill-concealed amusement, and perhaps should no longer look at them. Another ideal runs on before us, a strange, tempering ideal full of danger, to which we should not like to persuade anyone, because we do not so readily acknowledge anyone's right there to the ideal of a spirit who plays naively, that is to say, involuntarily, and from overflowing abundance and power, with everything that has hitherto uh, hitherto been called holy, good, intangible, or divine, to whom the loftiest conception with which the people have reasonably made their measure of value would already practically imply danger, ruin, abasement, or at least relaxation, blindness, or temporary self forgetfulness. The ideal of a humanly superhuman welfare and benevolence, which will often enough appear inhuman. For example, when put alongside of all past seriousness on earth and alongside of all past solemnities in bearing, word, tone, look, morality, and pursuit as their truest involuntary parody, and with which, nevertheless, perhaps the great seriousness only commences when the proper interrogative mark is set up. The fate of the soul changes. The our hand moves, and tragedy begins. Although the figure of Zarathustra and a large number of the leading thoughts in this work had appeared much earlier in the dreams and writings of the author. Thus, Speak Zarathustra did not actually come into being until the mouth of August 1881 in Sils Maria, and it was the ideal of the eternal recurrence of all things which finally induced my brother to set forth his new views in poetic language. In regard to his perhaps first conception of this idea, his autobiographical sketch Ecce Homo, written in the autumn of 1888, contains the following passage: "The fundamental idea of my work, namely the eternal recurrence of all things, this highest of all possible formulae of a yea-saying philosophy, first occurred to me in August 1881. I made a note of the thought on a sheet of paper with a postscript 6,000 feet beyond men and time. That day it happened to be wandering through the woods alongside of the lake of Silvaplana, and I halted beside a huge pyramidal and towering rock not far from Surley. It was then that the thought struck me. Looking back now, I find that exactly 2 months previous to this inspiration, I had an omen of its coming in the form of a sudden and decisive alteration in my taste, more particularly in music. It would even be possible to consider all Zarathustra as a musical composition, at all events a very necessary condition in its production was a renaissance in myself of the art of hearing. In a small mountain resort, Recoro near Vicenza, where I spent the spring of 1881, I and my friend and maestro Peter Gast, also one who had been born again, discovered that the for phonics music that hovered over us wrote us wore lighter and brighter plumes that it had done. Therefore, during the month of August 1881, my brother resolved to reveal the reaching of the eternal recurrence in a dithyrambic and psalmodic form through the mouth of Zarathustra. Among the notes of this period, we found a page on which is written the first definite plan of Thus Spake Zarathustra, Midday and Eternity, guides guide posts to a new way of living. Beneath there is written, Zarathustra, born on Lake Urmi, left his home in his 13th year, went into the province of Arya, and during 10 years of solitude in the mountains composed the Jend Avesta. The sun of knowledge stands once more at midday, and at and the midday, and the serpent of eternity lies coiled in its light. It is your time, your ye midday brethren. In that summer of 1881, my brother, after my years of steadily declining health, began at last to rally, and it is to the first to this first gust of the recovery of his once splendid bodily condition that we owe not only the gay science which is in mood which in its mood may be regarded as a prelude to Zarathustra, but also Zarathustra itself, just as he was beginning to recuperate his health. However, an unkind destiny brought him a number of most painful personal experiences. His friends caused him many disappointments, which were the more bitter to him in as much as he regarded friendship as such a sacred institution, and for the first time in his life he realized the whole horror of that loneliness to which perhaps all greatness is condemned, but to be forsaken is something very different from deliberately choosing blessed loneliness. How he longed in those days for the ideal friend who would thoroughly understand him, to whom he would be able to say all, and whom he reimagined he had found at various periods in his life from his earliest youth onwards. Now, however, that the way he had chosen grew ever more perilous and steep. He found nobody who could follow him. He therefore created a perfect friend for himself in a ideal form of a majestic philosopher, and made this creation the preacher of his gospel to the world. Whether my brother would ever have written, "Thus speaks Zarathustra," according to the first plan sketched in the summer of 1881. If he had not had a disappointments already referred to, is now an idle question. But perhaps where Zarathustra is concerned, we may also say with Master Eckhart's, the fleetest beast to bear you to perfection is suffering. My brother writes as follows about the origin of the first part of Zarathustra in the winter of 1882 to 1883. I was living on the charming little Gulf of Rapallo, not far from Genoa, and between Chiavari and Cape Portofino. My health was not very good. The winter was cold and exceptionally rainy, and the small inn in which I lived was so close to the water that at night my sleep would be disturbed if the sea were high. These circumstances were surely the very reverse of favorable, and yet spite of it all, and as if in demonstration of my belief that everything decisive comes to life in spite of every obstacle. It was precisely during this winter and in the mindset of these unfavorable circumstances that my Zarathustra originated. In the morning, I used to start out in a southerly direction up the glorious road to Jogli, which rises aloft through a forest of pines and gives one a view far out into the sea. In the afternoon, as often as my health permitted, I walked around the whole bay from Santa Margherita to beyond Portofino. This spot was all the more interesting to me in as much as it was so dearly loved by the Emperor Frederick III. In the autumn of 1886, I changed to be there again when he was revisiting this small forgotten world of happiness for the last time. It was on these two roads that all Zarathustra came to me. Above Above all, himself as a type, I ought rather to say that it was on these walks these ideas waylaid me. The first part of Zarathustra was written in about 10 days. This is to say, from the beginning to about the middle of February 1883. The last lines were written precisely in the hallowed hour when Richard Wagner gave up the ghost in Venice. With the exception of the 10 days occupied in composing the first part of this book, my brother often referred to this winter as the hardest and sickliest he had ever experienced. He did not, however, mean thereby his former disorders were troubling him, but that he was suffering from a severe attack of influenza, which he had caught in Santa Mar- Margherita, and which tormented him for several weeks after his arrival in Geneva. As a matter of fact, however, what he complained of most was his spiritual condition, that indescribable forsakenness to which he gives such heartrending expression in Zarathustra. Even the reception which the first part met with at the hands of friends and acquaintances was extremely disheartening, for almost all those to whom he presented copies of the work misunderstood it. I found no one ripe for many of my thoughts. The case of Zarathustra proves that one can speak with the utmost clearness and yet not be heard by anyone. My brother was very much discouraged by the feebleness of the response he was giving, and as he was striving just then, just then to give up the practice of taking hydrate of chloral, a drug he had begun to take while ill with influenza. The following spring, spent in Rome, was a somewhat gloomy one of him. He writes about it as follows: I spent a melancholy spring in Rome, where I only just managed to live, and this was not easy matter. This city, which is absolutely unsuited to the poet author of Zarathustra, and for the choice of which I was not responsible, made me inordinately miserable. I tried to leave it. I wanted to go to Aquila, the opposite of Rome in every respect, and actually founded in a spirit of enmity towards the city. Just as I also shall found a city someday, as a memento of an atheist and genuine enemy of the church, a person very closely related to me, the greatest uh, Hohenstaufen, the Emperor Frederick II, but fear lay behind it all. I had to return again to Rome. In the end, I was obliged to be satisfied with the pizza. Uh, Piazza Barberini. After I had exerted myself in vain to find an anti-Christian quarter, I fear that that on one occasion, to avoid bad smells as much as possible, I actually inquired at the Palazzo del Quirinale whether they could not provide a quiet room for a philosopher in a chamber high above the pizza just mentioned, from which one obtained a general view of Rome and could hear the fountains uh, placing far below. The loneliest of all song was composed, the night song. About this time I was obsessed by an unspeakably sad melody, the refrain of which I recognized in the words that through immorality. We remained somewhat too long in Rome that spring, and what with the effect of the increasing heat and the discouraging circumstances already described, my brother resolved not to write any more, or in any case not to proceed with Zarathustra, although I offered to relieve him of all trouble in connection with the proof and the publisher. When however when however we returned to Switzerland, towards the end of June, and he found himself once more in the familiar and exhilarating air of the mountains. All his joyous creative powers revived, and in a note to me announcing the dispatch of some manuscript, he wrote as follows: I have engaged a place here for 3 months. For truth, I am the greatest fool to allow my courage to be sapped from me by the climate of Italy. Now and again, I am troubled by the thought, what next? My future is the darkest thing in the world to me, but as there still remains a great deal for me to do, I suppose I ought rather to think of doing this than of my future, and leave the rest to thee and the goals. The second part of Zarathustra was written between the 26th of June and the 6th July this summer, finding myself once more in the sacred place where the first thought of Zarathustra flashed across my mind. I conceived the second part. 10 days su- sufficed neither for the second, the first, nor the third part have I required a day longer. He often used to speak of the ecstatic mood in which he wrote Zarathustra, how in his walks over hills and uh, dale the ideas would crowd into his mind, and how he would note them down hastily in a notebook from which he would transcribe on his return. Sometimes working till midnight, he says in a letter to me, you can have no idea of the way vehemence of such composition, and in Ikke Homo, Autumn 1888, he describes as follows: with passionate enthusiasm, the incomparable mood in which he created Zarathustra. Has anyone at the end of the 19th century any distinct notion of what poets of a stranger age understood by the word inspiration? If not, I will describe it. If one had a smaller vestige of superstition in one, it would hardly be possible to set aside completely the idea that one is the mere incarnation, mouthpiece, or medium of an almighty power. The idea of revelation, in the sense that something becomes suddenly visible and audible with in indescribable certainty and accuracy, which profoundly convulses and upsets one, describes simply the matter of fact. One hears, one does not seek, one takes, one does not ask, who gives. A thought suddenly flashes up like lightning. It comes with necessity, unhesitant unhesitatingly. I have never had any choice in the matter. There is an ecstasy such as the immense strain of it is sometimes relaxed by the flood of tears, along with which one's step either rush or involuntarily lag alternately. There is the feeling that one is completely out of hand, with the very distinct consciousness of an endless number of fine thrills and quiverings to the very toes. There is a depth of happiness in which the painfulest and gloomiest do not operate as antithesis, but as conditioned as demanded in the sense of necessary shades of color in such an overflow of light. There is an instinct for rhythmic relations which embraces wide areas of form's length. The need of a wide embracing rhythms is almost the measure of the force of an inspiration, a sort of counterpart to its pressure and intention. Everything happens quite involuntarily, as if in a tempestuous outburst of freedom, of absoluteness of power and divinity. The involuntariness of the figures and smiles is the most remarkable thing. One loses our perception of what constitutes the figure and what constitutes the smile. Everything seems to present itself as a uh, uh, radiest, the correct correctest and the simplest means of expression. It actually seems to use one of Zarathustra's own faces, as if all things came into one and would fain be sim, be similes. Here, do all things comes care singly to thy talk and flatter thee, for they want to ride upon thy back. On every smile dost thou hear, right to every truth. Here fly open unto thee all beings' words and word cabinets. Here all being when wanteth to become words. Here all becoming warneth to learn of thee how to talk. This is my experience of inspiration. I do not I do not doubt but that one would have to go back thousands of years in order to find someone who could say to me, "It is mine also." In the autumn of 1883, my brother left the Engadine for Germany and stayed there a few weeks in the following winter. After wandering somewhat erratically thought Stresa, Genoa, and Spezia. He landed in Nice, where the climate so happily promoted his creative powers that he wrote the third part of Zarathustra in the winter beneath the beneath the Halcyon sky of Nice, which then looked down upon me for the first time in my life. I found the third Zarathustra and came to an end of my task, the whole having occupied me scarcely a year. Many hidden corners and heights in the landscapes round about Nice are hollowed to me by unforgettable moments. That decisive chapter entitled Old and New Tables was composed in the very difficult ascent from the station to Isa, that wonderful Moorish village in the rocks. My most creative moments were always accompanied by un, unusual muscular activity. The body is inspired. Let us waive the question of the soul. I might often have been seen dancing in those days without a suggestion of fatigue. I could then walk for 7 or 8 hours on end among the hills. I slept well and laughed well. I was perfectly robust and patient. As we have seen, each of the three part of Zarathustra was written after a more or less short period of preparation in about 10 days. The composition of the fourth part alone was broken by occasional interruptions. The first notes relating to this part were written while he and I were staying together in Zurich in September 1884. In the following November, while staying at Menton, he began to elaborate these notes, and after a long pause, finished the manuscript at Nice between the end of January and the middle of February 1885. My brother then called this part the fourth and last, but even before and shortly after it had been privately printed, he wrote to me saying that he still intended writing a fifth and sixth part, and notes relating to these parts are now in my possession. This fourth part, the original MS of which contains these notes only for my friends, not for the public, is written in a particularly personal spirit, and those few of whom he presented a copy of it, he placed to the strictest secrecy concerning of its contents. He often thought of making this fourth part public also, but doubted whether he would ever be able to do so without considerably altering certain portions of it. At all events, he resolved to distribute this manuscript production, of which only 40 copies were printed. Only among those who had proved themselves worthy of it, and it speaks eloquently of his utter loneliness and need of sympathy in those days, that he had occasion to present only 7 copies of his book according to this resolution. Already at the beginning of this history, I hinted at the reason which led my brothers to select a Persian as the incarnation of his ideal of the majestic philosopher. His reasons, however, for choosing Zarathustra for all others to be his mouthpiece, he gives us in the following words. People have never asked me, as they should have done, what the name Zarathustra precisely means in my mouth, in the mouth of the first immoralist. For what distinguishes the philosopher from all others in the past is the very fact that he has exactly the reverse of an immoralist. Zarathustra was the first to see in the struggle between goods and evil as essential wheel in the working of things. The translation of morality into the metaphysical as force, cause, and in itself was his work. But the very question suggests its own answer. Zarathustra created the most port, uh, portentous error, morality. Consequently, he should also be the first to perceive that error, not only because he has had longer and greater experience of the subject than any other thinker. All history is the experimental refutation of the theory of the so-called moral order of things. The more important point is that Zarathustra was more truthful than any other thinker. In his teaching alone do we meet with truthfulness upheld as the highest virtue, the reverse of the cowardice of the idealist who flee from reality. Zarathustra had more courage in his body than any other thinker before or after him. To tell the truth and to aim straight, that is the first Persian virtue. Am I understood? The overcoming of morality through itself, thought, through, uh, through truthfulness, the overcoming of the moralist through his opposite, through me. That is what the name Zarathustra means in my mouth. Elizabeth Foster Nizsche. Thank you.